In Texas, a man sits on death row, waiting for an execution date set for October 16th, 2025. His name is Robert Roberson, convicted of killing his 2-year-old daughter more than 20 years ago. Prosecutors called it murder, but new evidence suggests something far more disturbing, that his daughter may have died from pneumonia and natural illness, not abuse. The only thing that sent him to death row was a controversial diagnosis, shaken baby syndrome. And today, that very science has been torn apart by leading experts across the country. So the haunting question remains, is Texas about to execute an innocent man? Stay with me, because in this story, the line between guilt and innocence may come down to science itself. And after you hear all the facts, I want you to tell me in the comments what you believe. Was Robert Roberson guilty, or has the justice system failed? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more final 24 hours, cases you won't find anywhere else. Because the truth in this case may come too late. In the early hours of January 2002, the small East Texas town of Palestine woke to the kind of tragedy that parents fear most. Robert Roberson, a quiet, reserved man in his mid-30s, carried his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki, into the emergency room of a local hospital. She was limp, barely breathing, her tiny body fighting for life. Doctors worked frantically, but what they saw alarmed them. Swelling in the brain, retinal hemorrhages, and bleeding inside the skull. Within hours, the medical team concluded that Nikki had been the victim of shaken baby syndrome, a diagnosis widely accepted in the early 2000s as near certain proof of abuse. To them, it meant only one thing. Someone had violently shaken the toddler until her brain gave out. Robert, who had no criminal record and no history of violence, suddenly found himself accused of the unthinkable, murdering his child. He told doctors and investigators that Nikki had been sick, that she'd been suffering from pneumonia, and wasn't herself in the days leading up to her collapse. But his words were drowned out by the authority of medical testimony. Prosecutors moved quickly. They painted Robert as an angry, frustrated father who had lost control. At trial in 2003, the shaken baby diagnosis was presented as fact, and the jury was told that nothing else could explain Nikki's death. Robert sat in court, silent, as the prosecution described him as a monster, while his own defense struggled to counter the overwhelming weight of the medical consensus of the time. When the verdict came, it was swift and devastating. Robert Roberson was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The quiet man who had once walked his daughter to church and tucked her in at night was now branded forever as a child killer. From death row, Robert maintained his innocence, but few were willing to listen. For nearly 2 decades, he lived in the shadow of conviction that seemed unshakable. Yet as the years passed, something began to shift. Science itself was beginning to question what had once been considered undeniable truth. If the very science that condemned Robert Roberson was wrong, how many years of his life, and how much of his daughter's story, had been stolen by a tragic mistake? At Robert Roberson's trial, the case against him rested almost entirely on shaken baby syndrome. The jury was told that a specific triad of symptoms, swelling of the brain, retinal hemorrhages, and bleeding inside the skull, could only mean one thing: violent shaking at the hands of an adult. It was, at the time, considered medical certainty. But as the years passed, that certainty began to unravel. Medical researchers and forensic specialists uncovered flaws in the very foundation of shaken baby theory. They discovered that the same triad of symptoms could appear in children who suffer from pneumonia, infections, accidental falls, seizures, and even clotting disorders. In other words, what doctors once believed was conclusive evidence of abuse could, in fact, be the tragic result of natural illness. Robert's own daughter, Nikki, had been suffering from pneumonia at the time of her collapse. Records showed that her oxygen levels were dangerously low, and she had been struggling with breathing issues that could have triggered a seizure. Experts who later reviewed her case explained that her brain injuries were consistent with oxygen deprivation caused by illness, not necessarily by abuse. What had once been irrefutable science was now under fire, and case after case across the country was being overturned as new evidence came to light. For Robert, this shift in medical understanding meant something monumental. The very diagnosis that condemned him to death might have been fatally flawed from the start. If shaken baby syndrome was no longer reliable science, then was Robert Roberson's death sentence built on nothing more than a dangerous medical myth? Despite the growing scientific doubt, Robert Roberson remained on Texas death row, locked in a cell no bigger than a bathroom, waiting for the state to carry out his sentence. For years, his appeals were denied. Judges upheld the conviction, repeating the same line. The jury had spoken and the evidence was clear. But behind the scenes, Robert's attorneys refused to give up. They gathered new expert witnesses, doctors who specialize in pediatric neurology and pathology, who combed through Nikki's medical history. Their findings were alarming. Nikki had been misdiagnosed, and her symptoms had likely been misunderstood by doctors who were relying on outdated science. Pneumonia, coupled with undiagnosed seizure activity, could have caused the very symptoms mistaken for abuse. In 2023 and 2024, his legal team filed powerful new motions, supported by affidavits from world-renowned medical experts. They argued that the state had convicted Robert based on testimony that science itself had since abandoned. To them, this wasn't just a tragic error. It was a wrongful conviction waiting to be corrected. But the courts were unmoved. Prosecutors continued to insist that the conviction was sound, that the jury had made its decision, and that Robert's execution should proceed. Even as the evidence of doubt piled higher, the legal system resisted reopening the case. With the courts refusing to bend, could any amount of new science or expert testimony save Robert from the lethal injection chamber? As Robert's case gained national attention, the streets outside Texas courthouses began to fill with voices of protest. Doctors, autism advocates, clergy, and ordinary citizens held signs that read, "Innocent on death row" and "Science matters." The growing movement argued that Texas was about to execute a man whose conviction rested on junk science. Prominent organizations, including groups devoted to wrongful convictions, filed legal briefs urging the courts to take another look. Medical experts warned that ignoring the new evidence would not only destroy one man's life, but also undermine trust in the entire justice system. For many, Robert's case became a symbol of something larger: how the law struggles to keep pace with evolving science. Still, the protests did little to sway the judges who held Robert's life in their hands. Each appeal seemed to meet the same cold response. The conviction stood. As the crowd outside grew louder, the silence inside the courtroom grew heavier. Would the pressure from the streets and the voices of experts finally force Texas to reconsider? Or would Robert's case march forward toward a deadly conclusion? In July 2025, the case reached its most chilling moment yet. A Texas judge signed a warrant that set Robert Roberson's execution date for October 16, 2025. After more than 2 decades of fighting, the countdown had officially begun. His attorneys were horrified. They argued that Texas was preparing to carry out one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in modern history. How could the state schedule an execution when leading scientists now said Nikki's death could not be explained by shaken baby syndrome? In a remarkable decision, Robert chose not to request clemency from the governor of Texas. He refused to plead for mercy for a crime he insisted he did not commit. Instead, he demanded a new trial, a chance to present the medical evidence that the jury in 2003 had never heard. His lawyers filed emergency appeals, warning that the state was about to execute a man who could very well be innocent. But the machinery of death in Texas is relentless, and the clock continued to tick. With October fast approaching, would the courts finally halt the execution? Or would Texas proceed with killing a man who might be innocent? Today, Robert Roberson's case stands as one of the most urgent and controversial death penalty cases in America. To prosecutors, he is still a convicted murderer, guilty of killing his daughter. But to doctors, legal experts, and protesters, he is a man condemned by a system that trusted science it no longer understands. The evidence now suggests Nikki's tragic death was caused by natural illness, not abuse. Yet the state of Texas continues to pursue his execution as if nothing has changed. His case has become a flashpoint, raising critical questions about the reliability of shaken baby convictions across the country. How many other parents, they ask, may have been wrongly accused under the same discredited theory? The stakes could not be higher. Robert has spent over 20 years behind bars, fighting not just for his life, but for the truth about his daughter's death. Now, with his execution date looming, every filing, every court decision, and every protest matters. Will Robert Roberson die branded as a child killer? Or will history remember him as a father destroyed by science that betrayed him?